Our gospel reading today comes from Matthew 25. For the next few weeks, we'll be looking at the three stories in Matthew chapter 25 and considering how these stories inform our journey to be a Matthew 25 church. Matthew 25 is the initiative from our national church that many other churches and presbyteries are joining in. And we seek to answer the call when our session decided to be Matthew 25 Church almost a year ago. And the call is to respond by working to end systemic poverty and structural racism and to create congregational vitality. So with that in mind, let us hear God's word for us today. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 young bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. Now, 5 of them were wise and the other 5 were foolish. The foolish ones took their lamps, but didn't bring oil for them. But the wise ones took their lamps and also took containers of oil. And when the groom was late in coming, they all became drowsy and went to sleep. But at midnight, there was a cry, "Look, the groom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. But the foolish bridesmaid said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil because our lamps have gone out." But the wise bridesmaids replied, "No, because if we share with you, there won't be enough for our lamps and yours. We have a better idea. You go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the groom came. Those who were ready went with him into the wedding. Then the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came and said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he replied, "I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep alert because you don't know the day or the hour." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Waiting isn't very fun, usually. Well, it can be fun if you're waiting for Christmas, but still it is uncomfortable. This week we were waiting for election results. Some people were quite anxious. And now the result has been called. But still, there's a larger waiting happening right now. I know I have held out hope and kind of this waiting for the end of the coronavirus. Like once we get back to normal, things will be better. And now I remember too, when Lydia was born, she was due on April 15th, 1-5, but a week and a half later, she had still not been born. So on April 25th, I finally did think that maybe I was going into labor, but it wasn't until 2 days later in the evening when she was actually born. She was almost 2 full weeks late. And I remember the anxiety of those days waiting for her arrival, how uncomfortable I felt, how people at work kept asking me, "Where's the baby?" And I had to hold myself back from responding, "She's right here." I really wanted her to be born, but people were right in that it was just as hard having a newborn as it was waiting for her to be born. It was just a different kind of hard. There's a Tom Petty song I've been thinking of this week about waiting is the hardest part. And maybe that's true, that waiting is the hardest part because we don't really like to live with uncertainty or the unknown. We just want things to kind of be settled. It makes us anxious, nervous, afraid when things are kind of up in the air like they have been for these past many months with the coronavirus. I feel that in myself too. Sometimes I catch myself and realize that I've been holding my breath, that I've like forgotten to take a deep breath for so long. In our parable today, they also have a time of waiting for the groom to arrive. Now, this parable is an uncomfortable parable. There's holes in it, in its logic. There's difficulty with it and its interpretation. And I struggle with this parable. Maybe you do too. How is it that the terrible thing the foolish bridesmaids did was just forget some oil? And why didn't their friends share with them? And then why didn't the groom just let them in when they got back? Why were they shut out? Who could blame them for thinking that the groom would be on time? Who could blame them for not imagining he would be so late? And why are we not so concerned about the groom who was so many hours late to this wedding party? Now, I may not like this parable also because it kind of points to me. I'm pretty sure that I, who am almost always late and often afraid of being unprepared, I would be the one shut out, cast out from the party. But it's also a confusing parable because this doesn't really sound like the Jesus from the rest of Matthew. If the groom is Jesus, the groom who's welcoming the bridesmaids into the wedding party, well, Jesus elsewhere in Matthew talks about the first shall be last and give to any who are in need. So what about this story? I don't have easy answers, but I do know that one thing that's not helpful is that it's all too easy for this parable to be about individuals and doing things perfectly and right and securing a future for our own individual selves. It's easy for us to write this kind of American narrative of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, make sure you have enough oil, make sure you're always prepared, and then you'll be good and all will be well. But again, that I don't think is the world in which Jesus inhabited. It's not the kind of culture that he was a part of, and it's not what the rest of his gospel talks about. Back in the Beatitudes, he shows us a different way. And he talks about being the light of the world and the salt of the earth, about fellowship and following, about bearing fruit, not just checking off boxes. So what then shall we do with this parable? if it is not that, not about simply securing our own place at the party. Well, I wonder if we maybe zoom out a little bit in terms of time and take more than just a snapshot of that moment, but zoom out to our whole lives. And also zoom out a little bit from thinking that each of us individually are those individual bridesmaids, but that collectively we are them. And also maybe that we all have both wise and foolish moments. This parable does call us to think about time and God's time, because it is part of this eschatological vision. Now, that's a big theological word, but that means about the end time, the finality of things. Time and God who comes. And how do we live our lives in response to that reality? We live between Christ's coming, Christ's incarnation at Christmas, and the final age, with the Greek word parousia, which is what Matthew is talking about here in Matthew 25. We'll go back to that each week. We live between Christ's first coming and Christ's second coming, and there's all this time in between. Now, the early Christians thought that Jesus was returning imminently, that he'd be back before they knew it. But we're still here 2,000 years later, wondering if that return will come, and seeing it has been 2,000 years, it's kind of maybe at the back of our minds. And again, that's something else I don't have an answer for, but I do want to share with you that Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a 12th century abbot and theologian, talked about a third coming, or a third advent. So the first being incarnation at Christmas, the second or the final one being God's coming at the end of time. But in the middle is the everyday arrival of Jesus. The knock at the door, the still small voice, a hungry mother, those who are imprisoned, hungry and thirsty. Jesus is coming again and again, according to Bernard of Clairvaux. And so Christian life is a matter of being ready to welcome him when he does. We live in the meantime, in that middle time where it is hard to wait. We yearn for God's reconciliation of all things. And so the call, though it is difficult, is to hold on to the belief that God does come, and to live our lives like that. And so if we're thinking about time and about these bridesmaids as larger than just our individual actions, about it not just being about being perfect and ticking off boxes, perhaps then our call is to orient ourselves to God's time, to prepare as a community for God's arrival, to keep our lamps trimmed and burning, again, as a community, to look for the light of Christ, to be the light for the world and the salt of the earth. Where is our attention? How is it that we spend our time? Are we orienting our lives to Christ's reign, even though it is so difficult? How are we being fueled for the journey? Now, the secret is that in any moment, as Bernard points to, there are these sort of little comings of Christ. And it is our attentiveness that allows us as a community and as individuals to see Christ. So when we look for Christ, we will see him. Waiting for God is hard. Wondering what will come of this world is difficult. But we know this, that God holds the future, that a wedding banquet is coming, and there will be great joy and great light. And so in the meantime, our call is the same as it has always been. And our call in these days, no matter who you voted for or how you are feeling about our country or the election, the call is for all of us to watch for Christ, to welcome him wherever we find him, to keep our lamps trimmed and burning, and to illuminate God's kingdom. God is our light, and the light shines in the darkness and will never overcome it. May we wait with hope. And when we lack hope, may we look to each other and hope together.